If you've heard of the Piggy Palace Massacre, then you know how horrific this story is. And if you've never heard of the Piggy Palace story, stick around until the end of the video and you will be horrified. Robert Pickton was born in 1949 in British Columbia, about 15 miles east of Vancouver, along with his brother and sister, and they were raised on a large pig farm by their parents who had passed away, so the property was handed down to their kids. Robert and his brother took over the daily operations of the farm, and over the next couple of decades, Robert and his brother tried to run the pig farm, but had no idea how to run one and eventually stopped taking care of it, and it drastically went downhill from there. The neighbors remembered seeing the pigs that were still there just roaming around the property, and somehow the two brothers had pretty much stopped bathing at this point. Despite walking around all day in the mud, it seemed like they never took off their boots, and when they would come inside, one of the few farm workers that decided to stay with the Picktons through the farm's downfall was a guy named Bill Hiscox. And he said the farm and Robert were both as creepy as it gets, and that he was prone to just total off-the-wall behavior even though he didn't smoke or drink or do any drugs. Eventually, the Pickton brothers realized they were not cut out to run the pig farm like their family had for generations, and they decided their best move was to sell portions of the land, but neither of them could have guessed just how much their land was worth, and from 94 to 95, they managed to sell off almost all of their property to an urban developer for over $5 million. And so suddenly, these pig farmers had become millionaires, and neither of them knew what to do with the money. After a year or so of sitting on the money and not doing much with it, they decided they wanted to do some good with their money, so they established an official charity in 1996 called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society, and their charity's purpose, at least on paper, was to help raise money for various organizations that they deemed worthy by running events like dances and shows. And while that might have been their original intention for this charity, what it really became was a disguise to host these wild drug and alcohol-fueled parties inside of their slaughterhouse, which, even though it wasn't being used anymore because they were no longer really doing any pig farming, it still had big hooks coming down from the ceilings and bloodstains all over the ground. These Piggy Palace parties became infamous in the city of Coquitlam, which is in Vancouver, drawing crowds of up to 2,000 people who were predominantly bikers, drug addicts, and prostitutes from the poverty-stricken downtown area. Robert Pickton had become familiar with that part of Vancouver because he used to go through there all the time to dispose of animal waste products at their rendering plant. And once the Piggy Palace charity was in full swing, Robert started going back into that neighborhood where he would cruise down the 10-block strip called the Low Track and would attempt to recruit people to come to his parties. Most of the people he recruited were dirt poor women who only agreed to go because he was offering them food, money, drugs, and alcohol. All at the same time Robert was running this recruiting campaign, women from the downtown area began disappearing, and these disappearances were noticed by the men and women in the downtown area. But they didn't report them because they had a general distrust of the police and authority figures in general. But as more and more women disappeared from the downtown area, rumors of a serial killer operating in that area started to circulate, so residents began only going outside if they could walk around in big groups of people, and everybody was just totally on edge, keeping a careful lookout for anything odd about the neighborhood, like people that shouldn't be there. But despite these added safety measures, women continued to go missing at a rapid rate, and nobody knew why. Residents of the downtown area saying, no, this is something different, there's something wrong here. The police basically said they were not getting involved, and when the newspapers found out about this completely passive response from the police, they criticized them for intentionally deprioritizing the missing women because the majority of them were drug addicts and prostitutes, and so they weren't worthy of a full investigation. The police denied this claim, and on the evening of March 22, 1997, 1 year after the Piggy Palace creation, they started throwing all these parties, and coincidentally, 1 year after, dozens of women had gone missing from the downtown area. One night, the Picktons' neighbor heard a frantic knock on their door, so they ran over and they opened it up, and what they saw was this woman who was hunched over with one hand on her bleeding stomach, and dangling from her wrist was a handcuff. The neighbor was obviously shocked at what they were seeing, but they quickly brought the woman in and called an ambulance, where the woman was rushed to the hospital and immediately was put in emergency surgery. Afterwards, while she was in recovery, she told her nurses that her name was Wendy, and she had been at one of the Piggy Palace parties, and one of the owners of the farm, Robert Pickton, had tried to put a handcuff on her, and when he did, she fought back, but then he drew a knife and he stabbed her in the stomach. But she was able to get the knife back, and she stabbed him in the face before turning and running out the door and making it to the neighbor's house. Right after she told the nurses what happened, guess who walks into the hospital? Robert Pickton. Actually showed up at the exact same hospital with a serious laceration on his face that was consistent with being stabbed. So the medical staff had already called the police, who showed up minutes later, and when they went inside, they searched Robert and they found a handcuff key inside one of his pockets. And that handcuff key opened the handcuff that was still on Wendy's wrist. So when the police saw that, they arrested Robert on attempted murder. And while Robert was still in custody, he explained to officers that Wendy was lying and that she was a drug addict who had come to one of their Piggy Palace parties and he had caught her trying to rob them. And when he confronted her, she drew a knife, and that's when a struggle occurred and both of them got stabbed, and that he was just lucky to be alive. The police actually believed him and dropped all the charges and let him go. When Robert got back to the farm, Bill Hiscox, the one worker who still worked for the Picktons, became even more suspicious of Robert, especially after having read all about the missing women from the downtown area. And he also knew Robert went over to that area regularly to pick up women and brought them back to his parties, and Bill just always had that gut feeling that something was off about Robert, and so he sat on his gut feeling for a couple of months until he finally decided he had to tell someone. And so he called the Crime Stoppers tip line, and he told them that he thought Robert had actually attacked Wendy, not the other way around, and that Robert was actually most likely behind some or all of the missing women cases from the downtown area. Bill also said that a recent female party guest at the farm had seen a pile of women's clothing inside of Robert's trailer, along with at least 10 purses, women's ID cards. So the police followed up with the lady to confirm what she saw, but she was scared of Robert and she said she wasn't going to cooperate. And so the police, without this testimony, were unable to secure a search warrant to investigate this further, and they kind of just forgot about it and moved on to other cases. Over the next few years, the Picktons continued to throw these huge Piggy Palace parties until the city finally shut them down after dozens more women had disappeared from the downtown area without a significant police investigation, despite the fact that Bill was calling them all the time to say he believed Robert Pickton was behind all of these disappearances. But they weren't taking him seriously. Finally, in 2002, a former employee of the Pickton farm came forward to police and said that he personally had seen illegal weapons inside of Robert's trailer, and this was enough information for police to get a search warrant and raid the pig farm. Inside Robert's trailer, they found illegal guns as well as several items directly connected to some of the missing women from the downtown area, and Robert was arrested but let out on bail, but he was put under surveillance and told he could not go back to the farm until they were done conducting a more thorough search. And during that more thorough search, they found blood from one of the missing women inside of Robert's trailer, and so Robert was rearrested and charged with murder. While he was being held in jail, he shared a cell with another man who he believed was just another detainee, but he wasn't. He was actually an undercover police officer, and their entire interaction was being recorded, and on this recording, Robert makes a few shocking statements. Robert admits in the video he killed 49 people, who would turn out to be the majority of the missing women from the downtown area, and after a lengthy investigation, it was determined Robert's killing spree began in 1991, but it really kicked up a notch in 1996 when he and his brothers started Piggy Palace because he was able to use their huge parties to lure more victims to his farm faster, and once they were at his farm, he would lure them to his trailer and he would handcuff them and tell them it's over now, and then he would inject antifreeze into them or he would strangle them to death. Afterwards, he would move the victim's body to the slaughterhouse where he would butcher them, and large portions of the victim's remains would be fed to his pigs, and parts he didn't feed to his pigs he would bring to the rendering plant, which takes animal waste products, crushes them up, and turns them into a gelatin. And this gelatin is used in everyday products from candy to cosmetics, which means Robert's victims wound up in things like lipstick and possibly gummy bears. Also, sometimes while Robert was going through this horrific disposal process, he would set aside some of the best cuts of meat and grind them up with pork, and then turn them into sausage, which was served at the Piggy Palace parties, and it was also given to neighbors, food banks, and even orphanages. After sifting through thousands of meters of soil and pig feces underneath the Pickton farm, investigators were only ever able to find little bits of remains of 26 women, and Robert was charged with all 26 murders, but only 6 turned into convictions due to a lack of evidence, and he was sentenced to life in prison and is still alive today. Thanks for watching.